In a small town in Colombia, while people slept safe and sound, a weeping noise easily overlooked emanated from a man, or more specifically, a monster who, after committing a heinous crime, pleaded for forgiveness at the church altar. A man who performed satanic rituals with the corpses of his victims cried desperately for forgiveness, embodying the pinnacle of hypocrisy. He sought absolution while having sold his soul to the devil, a deed he openly acknowledged, with 221 victims to his name. To you and me, this number is staggering, but to him, they were merely names recorded in his little blue book. And, as we'll discover, this isn't even the full tally. In a town in Colombia, 8 boys lost a finger in an odd accident that shocked the local population. How could someone lose a finger playing hide and seek? The townsfolk deemed it a bizarre, borderline disturbing incident. The accident stripped hope and light from the faces of the 8 boys, transforming their once cheerful, happy expressions into fearful gazes, with panic pervading every aspect of their lives. What had upended their lives was certainly not a round of hide and seek. As rumors began to circulate, some speculated that the perpetrator was the new beggar in town, while others claimed it was a priest. Some were surprised, remarking, "I thought it was a crazy man," albeit slightly different. 2 things, however, were obvious. First, the culprit was not a local, and second, the man, whether perceived as a priest, beggar, or crazy person, had deliberately isolated himself by adopting roles that society either pitted as lost causes or viewed as too strict, thereby discouraging anyone from engaging in conversation with him, or, at the very least, limiting interactions to a select few. A crazy man was deemed too dangerous, while a priest was considered too judgmental. One day, the police were called. The content of the call was the discovery of a mass grave. Within it lay 36 tiny bodies, the bodies of children. It's a no-brainer that somebody or a group of people did this. You don't just find 36 bodies casually buried around. At that period of time, Colombia was going through a lot, so the natural way of thinking was not, "Oh my God, there is a serial killer on the loose." No, it was maybe the doing of cartels, organ traffickers, satanic cults. The last thing that came to mind, and that if it came to mind at all, was a serial killer looming around, especially with cartels from Pablo Escobar's to the Cali cartel. Well, if you look at it at the time, it makes sense, and it doesn't at the same time. They could kill a child or 2 to send a message, but 36 was a lot, even by their standards. Also, Pablo Escobar's cartel, despite ruthlessly killing almost 4,000 souls, I heard his was tender toward children, especially the ones from his village. That left investigators with 3 possibilities. Either organ traffickers, which was most likely because this business was so abundant, with 1.7 billion a year in the organ trade, it gave birth to what they call organ tourism, where foreigners in need of a transplant came to Colombia to fulfill that because it's illegal in their hometowns. But wait, something was off. The most important thing in organ trafficking is delicacy and precision. 2 important factors missing from the 36 bodies. Upon closer inspection, they noticed a lot of cuts were made incredibly messily, something a broker would never do. 2 possibilities remain: satanic cults or a serial killer. Yet again, the state of the bodies tells everything. The torture marks and decapitated bodies fit satanic rituals, but why did all the bodies have their right foot chopped off? And why leave it behind? It doesn't make any sense. A serial killer, that was the case. Now, how about we go back in time, way back in Genova, Colombia? The oldest in a family of 7 kids. Life was not easy, especially if you add a dad with a pig's mindset, drinking all day, wasting the money he should have spent on his family. Each day, the same scenario would unfold. A drunken pig enters the house, beating anyone that came into his way with a belt. If there was no food or it wasn't ready, the mom would get beaten up over and over. At first, being the oldest, he would step up to his father, defending his mother, leading him to show up to school the next day with bruises all over his body, causing him to get bullied. Eventually, he did stop defending his mother. To him, it was apparent that no matter what he does, his mother will never leave, deeming his struggles pointless. At some point, he started hating everyone around him, especially those who had what he didn't. A mindset that goes like, why am I the only one suffering? They shouldn't have a loving parent, a good father. Why did they come up unbruised to school? And so on. Everyone who had a normal life, he hated him. The kid is living the worst life possible, right? Well, it would go even further. At some point, a family friend came into their lives, and I think this was the pivotal moment that gave birth, or at least planted the seed, of the man who would be dubbed the Beast of Genova. The similarity between what this man put Luis through and what Luis ended up committing or putting his victims through is jarring. That family friend, one night, pretending to hang out with the father, would get Luis alone, tie him up, and brutally assault him. Afterward, he would go get a candle, light it up, then use the flame to burn the sensitive parts of Luis's body, like the hairs on his private parts. Usually, it didn't just stop there. The piece of shit would go further and bite Luis's most sensitive parts. He would bite down and watch Luis cry out in pain while he would simultaneously satisfy himself. A cycle that lasted for 2 years until the family moved away, so the family friend was no longer in the picture. Unfortunately, Luis escaped the prison but landed at his doorstep. What I mean by that is the family made a new friend, a priest this time, and the suffering continued, and with it grew Luis's anger. What is the difference between a murderer and a serial killer? The answer to that question is the thrill. A human being generally kills out of anger, fear, sadness, vengeance, but a psychopath kills because he enjoys doing so. Normal people enjoy traveling, playing games, hanging out, watching anime. For serial killers, that same enjoyment comes from killing people. After all the hardship he experienced, the only thing in Luis's mind was to prevent anyone from experiencing the assault he went through. If you thought this was the case, then, dear viewer, you're simply wrong, very wrong. That's the good/normal people's way of thinking. Luis, on the other hand, couldn't wait to make an innocent boy go through what he went through. At 15 years old, his urges started to manifest, and the first ones to experience that were his little siblings. One day, out of nowhere, he's lining up his little siblings, yelling at them to get in line. He strips down all their clothes, and from there, he goes one by one, tracing his hands on them, or as he describes it, a light, smooth touch. Other sources claimed he would go further, forcing them to sleep unclothed in the same bed as him, and when they were asleep, he would touch them, but we are unsure of that. At 20, that's when he finally started engaging or somewhat fulfilling his fantasies. And I said somewhat because he didn't start killing his victims as of yet, only assaulting and torturing them. His go-to spot was the park. He would hide in the bushes with his machete, waiting for any little kid to pass by, and after he spotted his soon-to-be victim, he would jump out of the bushes and lunge at them. Sometimes he would lure them with candy, drinks, toys, whatever he thought he could entice little boys with, tie them up in a secluded area, and start his sick routine. One of his early victims, William True, was brave enough to share what he experienced with the world. He said that Luis forced him out of his clothes, biting him painfully all over. And the worst part was that he was so silent doing everything. His stench, William said, smelled like a farm worker after a long day of work. William was tortured and held captive in that park for 12 hours. Even in his earlier crimes, it's clear Luis likes both the mental torture and the physical. About 200 children were captured by Luis, brutally assaulted, and ultimately released. 200 children are not even his murder victims. After each victim, Luis would upgrade his torture methods, experimenting with different ways, such as inflicting shallow cuts all over their bodies with razors. Notably, he ensured that his torture tactics didn't kill the victims, as he derived pleasure from seeing them in pain. Even his eventual murder victims had to endure hours of torture before being killed, as this was an integral part of his sadistic ritual, mirroring the abuse he suffered at the hands of a priest and a family friend, including being burned with candles and bitten all over his body. Disorganized in almost all other aspects of his crimes, Luis was methodical when it came to torture. It was his Bible, his cookbook. Every detail had to be in a specific order. The torture always followed the same sequence, every single time. For 12 years, Luis went unnoticed, constantly assaulting little boys and meticulously recording their names in his blue book. What's astounding is that for 12 years, he assaulted boys left and right, yet no one reported him, and the police failed to identify him. Back then, the prevailing thought was that the police were largely under the control of cartels and gangs. If a father dared to report his son's assault, it might have been his last act in town. he would have gone from the police department straight to his grave, as it was risky to assume whether a cartel member was involved. Consequently, approaching the authorities was not a viable option, which explains why many of Lewis's victims remain unidentified to this day. One day, after 12 years of assaulting little boys, Lewis finally committed the atrocity that earned him the notorious title, the Beast of Genova. If you thought the previous descriptions were graphic, what follows is on an entirely different level. As I warned, one day after getting drunk, Lewis thought, "Today is the day." He then proceeded to his favorite spot, a park, after purchasing a pack of cigarettes, a cord, a knife, and a cheap bottle of brandy. Sitting there, he waited for the unfortunate boy who would become his next victim. Unfortunately, it wasn't long before he managed to lure a boy, which wasn't hard, given that many children, driven by necessity to provide for their families, venture out to work. Offering money was all it took to secure a victim. Lewis grabbed the boy's hand and led him into a secluded wooded area. Once isolated enough, he tied the boy up, bit him everywhere, and then assaulted him. Usually, at this point, he would release the boys, but this time was different. His usual satisfaction wasn't achieved, and in a moment of heightened anger, he beat the boy to death with his bare hands. Covered in blood, Lewis walked off, went home, took a shower, and afterward, updated his blue book with a new name, under a new section that would later include 220 other names. And, as is common among serial killers, to relive the murder and re-experience the thrill, he ensured that taking trophies became a mandatory part of his ritual from that night onward. From that day forward, Lewis's sick desires escalated, as did the gruesomeness of his crimes. He would punch his victims' hands with such force that he would totally crush them, bearing in mind that his victims were small, delicate children whose hands could be crushed merely by squeezing too hard. He also sliced their buttocks and lightly stabbed their kidneys, letting them bleed slowly as he continued to torture them for hours. His killing cycle would culminate in slitting their throats while actively assaulting them. After completing his heinous act, he would finalize it by cutting off their private parts and placing them into the mouths of the decapitated heads, a gruesome signature that set his murders apart from others. One night, typically late for Lewis's taste, he ventured out, despite his aversion to killing at night. Ironically, a man who had committed heinous crimes, including beheading and mutilation, was afraid of the dark. Recall the question investigators posed at the beginning: why the chopped off right feet? Here's the answer. What slipped Lewis's mind was that, while the police were ineffective, people had started to take notice. Mothers kept their children indoors, and that night, someone apparently witnessed him attacking a kid in the woods and alerted the police. This situation was unprecedented for Lewis. The police had never come close to catching him. The thought of being captured, to say the least, made him panic. Despite this close call, he ensured the victim at hand was killed before hastily departing, breaking his right leg in the process. This injury would leave him limping, a testament to how close he came to being caught and, more importantly, a reminder that people were now watching. Given Lewis's feelings about lacking what others had, from that day forward, chopping off the right feet of his victims became a necessity for him. Additionally, the incident involving the 8 little boys, an attempt to satiate another warped fantasy, turned into a nightmare, depriving Lewis of sleep. After this close call, all sorts of thoughts swirled in his brain. After all, these 8 boys now knew exactly how he looked, smelled, and sounded. The questions haunted him. What if they reported him? What if he got caught? What if this was the end? Nothing happened, but one thing was certain. There would be no 9th boy. Following this, Lewis's method, or what is termed his modus operandi MO, changed, mirroring his psychological development. His torture methods expanded, becoming more grotesque, including removing victims' eyeballs with a screwdriver, cutting off their fingers, chopping off their right foot, and ultimately opening up their stomach to remove their intestines, which he would place beside their heads. Alarmingly, these little boys were kept alive for hours, a feat medically possible, and exacerbated by Lewis's chain smoking, which led to him taking breaks to smoke while torturing. Notably, Detective Mark did his best, but by this point, it was too late to catch up with Lewis. Leads were everywhere, and each time Lewis changed his disguise, adopting personas from marginalized positions in society. No one wanted to engage with him. This tactic kept the police in circles, further complicated by the police's refusal to categorize these cases as the work of a serial killer, despite Detective Duran's attempts to persuade them. The entire situation was a mess until the cornstalk incident. What's that, you may ask? Well, here it is. One fateful night as our monster was fulfilling his thirst, and we know that he is a chain smoker. Guess what? He didn't fully finish his cigarette and threw it, still lit, into the ground. However, this time the location was different, a cornfield. Just like that, the fire consumed everything around it. Being a large fire, the entire community acted quickly, as did the police. Upon arriving, it was obvious to the detective that this was his work. Every aspect of the crime scene pointed to him, the style of killing, the signature, and more. This murder was fresh, recent, and this time they had a chance, especially given the plethora of evidence he left behind, like his shoes and glasses, which initially seemed like minor clues. However, upon closer inspection, these items revealed more than just shoe size and eye prescription. The glasses suggested the suspect had a fondness for classic styles, popular 10 years prior, indicating the killer might be in their 40s. The shoes told an even more detailed story. The soles were uneven, with the left side more worn, suggesting a limp and uneven weight distribution. This led investigators to suspect the killer had a noticeable limp. The emerging picture was of a man potentially in his 40s, 5 feet 3 inches to 5 feet 4 inches based on his shoe size, with poor eyesight and a noticeable limp. Furthermore, they predicted the man had second-degree burns. The only explanation for leaving his glasses and shoes was that he was sleeping beside the corpse, which wasn't odd for a man who would place a victim's private parts in their mouth. It seemed plausible that he got caught off guard by the flames, leading to his hasty escape, hence leaving his belongings behind. Luis Garavito survived, but he didn't go to the hospital despite his second-degree burns. Instead, he received treatment from a vet. It's unclear how he managed this, but he did. This time, he evaded the police who were looking for him at hospitals, but not for long. Now, he was visible even to the police. One detail previously unmentioned was the police's register of offender lists, consisting of 5,200 names. They eliminated all names charged with assaulting girls, as the victims were all boys, leaving 1,600 names. Then, they removed anyone younger than 40, narrowing it down to 95 names. After eliminating those who didn't match Lewis's height, they had a list of 25 names, among which was Lewis. Do you want to know how they caught him? Initially, they caught the wrong man who fit the description perfectly, but one thing was odd: the murders didn't stop. In fact, they discovered 4 more bodies, all new, indicating they had the wrong man. This left them with 24 more suspects. Detective Mark went out to question all 24 families of the suspects, one of whom was Lewis's sister. Upon questioning her, she mentioned, "You know what? My brother was acting weird lately. He left me this bag and was very insistent on not opening it." That's how they got him. The bag was filled with Lewis's trophies, notably his newspaper clippings. After discovering his identity, the arrest of Luis Garavito wasn't as difficult as some might imagine. He was no longer a young man in his prime, but rather a frail 40-something with a weakened body, poor vision, and an inability to walk straight. Add to that the second-degree burns he suffered, and it wasn't long before he was apprehended after a child reported to the police that a man had tried to assault him. Garavito was a monster disguised as a human, preying on over 400 innocent children. He had no right to steal their futures. Tragically, even justice, or what could barely be called justice, failed them. The Colombian court sentenced him to 40 years from a total of 1,853 years, later reduced to 40 and then to 20 years. Their humanity prevented them from sentencing him to death or even life imprisonment. In their view, every person, no matter how heinous their crimes, deserves freedom. This mindset conveniently overlooked the enormity of his atrocities. Thus, the life of each of the 221 Colombian children he brutally took equated to mere months of imprisonment. What enraged me even more was that, even in prison, which in Colombia at the time and even now is a place where death might seem preferable, Garavito lived like royalty. He had his own cell, guarded around the clock by police to prevent other inmates from killing him. When it was decided that he would be released on October 10th, 2023, divine justice prevailed. Luis Garavito died before his release, succumbing to leukemia and eye cancer. And so, the case of Luis Garavito comes to an end. Let us hope that no society or nation ever encounters a monster as heinous as him again.